In this lesson, we talk about Irradiance Cache GI engine. Before going through this lesson, I want you to know my opinion about Irradiance caching as a GI solution. I haven't used it in several years, just to be honest with you. And as our machines become more capable, using shortcuts that sacrifice accuracy for speed becomes unacceptable. And Irradiance Cache is one of those shortcuts. It's a good solution if you have a very moderate computer. Beyond that, nobody uses it anymore. And personally, I haven't seen being used in production in a very long time. So that is why I won't be going through every single parameter of Irradiance Cache, and I'll be just covering some of the fundamental concepts about it and some of its more important parameters. You can safely skip this video and move on to the next one, as I won't be using it in the rest of the course and you probably won't be using it in your projects. So let's get started. The key difference between Irradiance Cache and brute force is the fact that in Irradiance Cache, instead of computing GI for all the shaded points that are visible to the camera, GI will only be computed at some points and interpolated for others. Let's open up our render settings. Set Irradiance Cache as your primary engine, and as you can see, there is no Irradiance Cache in the secondary engine. That's because it only can be used as a primary engine. For now, we can disable secondary engine by setting bounces to 1 to focus on Irradiance Cache. In the render view, load the render from the side view. The camera is roughly here in the scene. As it is a view-dependent method, the first rays are shot from the camera into the scene to determine the placement of the GI samples. Now remember, unlike brute force, we wouldn't have one sample at each shaded point. The samples will be created for only some points in the scene. So when one of these rays hits a point on a surface, a GI sample will be created. From these points, the hemispherical burst of GI rays will be traced into the scene to gather information. And the number of these rays is controlled by the rays parameter in the Irradiance Cache settings. Obviously, more rays equals to a higher quality GI solution. Okay, now we have the GI solution for some of the points in the scene. What about the points that weren't lucky enough to get any GI samples? For those points, Redshift takes some of the already calculated samples from around that point and interpolates between them and averages them out to come to a solution for that point. And the same thing will happen for the other unsampled points in the scene. And like before, if we have a secondary GI engine enabled, when a GI ray hits a surface, the secondary engine tries to bounce that ray in the scene. One essential thing you need to know about Irradiance Cache is that it's produced in several passes. What I mean by that is, let's say in the first pass, the samples are created all over the place randomly. In that first pass, Irradiance Cache tries to assess the scene and see where are the details in the scene. In the next passes, in each pass, it tries to add more samples to more detailed and more complex parts of the scene, and this process happens before the final render begins. I'm going to open up the AOV manager from the Redshift menu and add global illumination AOV. Take a render and see what we get without changing anything else. Irradiance Cache, as mentioned, is created in several passes. Right now, based on our current Irradiance Cache settings, we are using 4 passes to generate Irradiance Cache. As this is a simple scene, that process is very fast. We can decrease or increase the number of these passes using these min-max rate values. In the first pass, it tries to get an idea of the scene, and in the following passes, it adds more and more samples to the detailed areas. And after those passes are calculated, we start to render the final image. This is our render, and as you can see, it took a few seconds, which is very quick, and we have a fairly clean render. And if I go to the GI pass, you can see it's clean, even though it might lack some details compared to the brute force render. In the Irradiance Cache settings, you can use these presets to control a large number of Irradiance Cache settings. So obviously when you go from low preset to high preset, you're going to increase the overall quality of your Irradiance Cache and also increase your render times or the time Redshift needs to calculate GI. We also have these three other parameters, including raise, adaptive amount, and adaptive error threshold that won't be affected by the preset buttons, and we have to work on them manually. Each of these presets contain predefined settings for some of the Irradiance Cache parameters, which are min and max rate, color, noise, and distance thresholds, and a few other things. Right now, we don't have any idea what these parameters are doing, so let's set the preset to custom so we can adjust these parameters as we wish. The first and the most important Irradiance Cache parameters are min rate and max rate. Remember, we mentioned Irradiance Cache is created in several passes, and each pass adds more samples to the more detailed areas. Not only we can control the number of those passes using min rate and max rate, but we can also control the resolution at which those GI passes are being calculated. Right now, min rate is set to -3 and max rate is set to 0. That means we have 4 passes, -3, -2, -1, and 0. If I change my min rate to -4, now we get 5 passes, -4, -3, -2, -1, and 0. And if let's say max rate is set to 1, now we'll be having 6 passes, -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, and 1. And with each pass, we'll add more samples to the detailed areas. Now let's set the min rate to -3 and max rate to 0. Min rate determines the resolution for the first GI pass, the one with the least amount of detail. If min rate is set to 0, this pass would have the same resolution of the final image. If set to 1, we are doubling the resolution of our final output to calculate Irradiance Cache in that particular pass. And if set to -1, it would have half of the final image resolution, and so on. So when set to something like -3, we are using a very low resolution to calculate the first GI pass, and this pass would be good enough for large, flat, even areas. And as we go through the other passes, we increase the resolution twice each time and add more samples to the detailed areas. And max rate determines the resolution of the final GI pass. So clearly, if you use a min rate of, let's say, 0 and max rate of 3, you will also have 4 passes, but those 4 passes will have higher quality compared to, let's say, -3 and 0. They would take more time to calculate, and at 1, for example, we will have double the resolution of the final image. But the right thing to do is to always make sure min rate has a negative value so we can calculate the less interesting and more flat, even areas very quickly. So the higher resolution passes would be used to calculate more complex areas. You normally don't have to use anything more than 1 as the max rate value, and maybe 2 in very extreme scenarios. Let's take 2 renders. For the first one, set the min and max rate to -7 and -4. Take a render and add it to the snapshots. And for the next render, set the min and max rate to -3 and 0. If we take a render, and save this one as well and compare the 2 renders. In the lower quality render, you can see tons of details are gone. Take a look at the contact shadows here, and if you compare it to our higher quality render, you can see the contact shadows are almost gone, and you can see that throughout the scene. You can also see some artifacts here and there if you pay close attention. For now, set it to -3 and 0, and let's use the medium preset. The last parameter I want to cover here is the raise value. Raise controls the number of primary GI rays, the red rays if you remember. So the higher this number, the higher the quality of our GI samples. Let's render our scene with different raise number and see what we get. Let's set it to 1 and take a render. As we can see, we have an extremely splotchy render. That's because each sample can send only 1 ray and the quality of the samples will be very low and therefore an inaccurate GI solve. Next, set it to 4 and take another render. And obviously the quality is a lot better compared to our previous render, but still very splotchy and unusable. And as we start increasing the number of rays and render, we get a higher quality GI solution each time. Let's set it to its default of 2000s. Normally 2000 will be enough for most cases. For more detailed, complex interior shots and more difficult lighting shots, you might need to use values like 4000 or even higher. Now that's enough for Irradiance Cache, as it's no longer used in modern workflows, and I have a gut feeling they might actually remove it completely in the future releases. I skipped the rest of the parameters here. Let's finish up the GI solution. We can use the medium preset for most cases, especially in simple scenes like what we have here, and get an acceptable result. For more demanding detailed scenes, you can opt in for the high preset. Raise at 2000s is more than enough. Let's set our bounces to 4. For the secondary engine, we will use point cloud. We can decrease the noise threshold to 0.005 to get a cleaner direct lighting pass, as when using Irradiance Cache and point cloud as our primary and secondary GI engines, you wouldn't get any high frequency noise in your final GI solution. Now let's take a render and see what we get. The render only took around 7 seconds, very fast, and we get this clean render. For this type of very simple scenes, Irradiance Cache can be useful, but for more complex setups or animations, using Irradiance Cache should not be considered. Now let's go to the second scene for this lesson. Let's open up the render settings and go to the GI tab. And change the primary engine to Irradiance Cache and secondary engine to point cloud. As it is a more complex scene, I'm gonna change the preset to high, which gives us a -3 and 1 as the mean and max rate. Increase raise to 4000 as it's a more complex scene, and that would increase the render time as well. And for animations, we need to do a lot of preparations when using Irradiance Cache, and that would increase both the render time and getting to render time, which if you think about it, we can simply opt in for the brute force, which has no settings, and get perfect result every time for stills and animations. That's why I no longer use Irradiance Cache. For the point cloud, let's set the screen radius to 8 and samples per pixel to 32. And increase retray threshold to 2, and finally decrease the global noise threshold to 0.003. We can also add our global illumination AOV. Now let's take a render to see what we get. Because we have used higher settings for the Irradiance Cache, the prepass takes longer before the final render starts. So here is our render, which took around 30 seconds. The result is acceptable with some minor flaws, especially if we take a look at more detailed areas of the scene. If I zoom in, we start to notice some of the issues, and it would be more visible in the global illumination pass. Some loss of detail and splotches around the shadow lines. Contact shadows are not that defined. So that's about Irradiance Cache. My advice to you is just use brute force instead, and you will get perfect render each and every time for stills or animations. God forbid if you use Irradiance Cache for any sort of animation. If you don't set it up perfectly, the render will be called Flicker Town. Irradiance Cache is basically like an old football player or soccer player. He's been here for a very long time. He was great at his time a decade ago, but there are better players now. We can keep him on the side for a bit longer as he's done a lot for the club in the past. Soon he has to leave. We'll never talk about Irradiance Cache in this course again. See you in the next video.